Today we'll be discussing the Dred Scott Decision and how this court case affected America. First, a short explanation of the Missouri Compromise will be necessary. The Missouri Compromise was created to keep a balance between slave states and free states. It split the Louisiana Purchase on the 3630 parallel and decreed everything north of that line, except Missouri, to be a free territory. Everything south of that boundary would be a slave territory. Dred Scott, a slave, moved with his master John Emerson from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois and then back on to Wisconsin, which were both above the 3630 line of latitude. Scott would eventually marry in Wisconsin, and later his wife would return to Missouri with Emerson. John Emerson soon passed away, and Scott offered to buy his freedom from Miss Emerson, the widow of John Emerson. Miss Emerson rejected that offer, and Scott sued on the ground that their movement into free territory, as created by the Missouri Compromise, had emancipated them. His ideas were based on the earlier Whitney versus Whiteside's case, that once free, always free, which was determined by the Missouri Supreme Court. Scott would decide to sue Miss Emerson in court, but lost on a technicality, as Scott couldn't prove that he and his wife were actually owned by Mrs. Emerson. In 1850, Scott was retried in a lower Missouri court, as decided by the Missouri Supreme Court, and was declared a free man. Just 2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court would step in again and repeal the decision of the lower court that made Scott a free man. Scott and his lawyers would then decide to bring this case to the Missouri Circuit Court in 1854. The Circuit Court would agree with the decision made by the Missouri Supreme Court. Scott then turned to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices had severe biases in terms of slavery, as 7 of the 9 had been appointed by pro-slavery presidents, and 5 of those 9 justices actually owned slaves themselves. The United States Supreme Court ruled that free black men were not actually citizens of the United States and could not sue in federal courts. The Supreme Court also ruled that since slaves were property, that Congress had no power to control slavery in the western states. The decision endorsed the expansion of slavery. Following the Dred Scott case, there were some serious social and political repercussions through American society. The case was an accumulation of pro- and anti-slavery sentiment following the Compromise of 1850. The main reason the case created such a divide was because of the different interpretations it brought forth. Northern abolitionists refused to accept the new ruling that slavery was legal in all territories in pending statehood. They simply denied that this was the actual consequence of the Dred Scott Decision and would not agree with the overjoyed Southern whites, who held that slavery was now legalized throughout the entire country. This led in part to the Bleeding Kansas crisis, in which illegitimate settlers ignored the recent Supreme Court ruling and attempted to implement popular sovereignty in deciding the state's position on slavery. Another ramification of the Dred Scott Decision was the heated Lincoln-Douglas debates. In the campaign for Illinois senatorship, Abraham Lincoln challenged Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas to a series of debates in which Stephen Douglas's renouncement of the Dred Scott ruling alienated the southern half of the Democratic Party. This divide would come into play in the presidential election of 1860, when the Democratic split would aid Lincoln in winning the election. This event catalyzed the secession of the South. In essence, the Dred Scott Decision was a major factor in the inception of the Civil War.